I don't think it's particularly effective for me to like shout at strangers and say like, you have to accept me for who I am. It doesn't work and it's not effective. But I have found that just showing up as myself, it kind of comes back to embodiment and just like embodying who I am and what I have to offer the world. That has a much bigger impact. There is a way to stand up for what you believe and what you feel is true for you and also be compassionate. And I think that's what we are missing, especially in the United States right now.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Willow Defebaugh. Willow is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Atmos, a magazine inspired by nature. It truly has absolutely wonderful writing. I've been reading Atmos for years. It covers sort of everything we're living through really intersectionally. So I would encourage everybody to go and read it. And also to listen to their podcast, The Nature of, which is hosted by Willow. And you'll get a feel for exactly what that podcast contains by listening to her on this episode. This is one of those really beautiful conversations that sort of mediates and meditates and seeks to understand by adding layers of complexity rather than peeling them away. We begin by discussing the romanticization of nature. Does nature have a plan and a design or not? What can we learn from the way that nature is mediated? What can we understand about systems in the way that nature unfolds? How does the human behavior that we're seeing around the world that is contributing to the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the poly crisis, a question of morality rather than biological impulse? How do the feelings of shame trigger worsening behavioral patterns that then only perpetuate a crisis? How do we have conversations with one another and with people with whom we disagree? How does the left begin to unravel what it has done wrong over the past decade by creating a culture of virtue signaling, a politics of narcissism? And how can we be accountable for perpetuating the systems of division and separation in order to build bridges with one another? Willow offers at a moment that the opposite of dissociation is embodiment. And we return to that theme over and over and over in the conversation. How do we see each other as interconnected bodies rather than political identities? How do we make room for everybody's lived experience without resorting to the cult of individualism? How do we heal together? How do we practice empathy? What is empathy? And as Willow says, how do we learn to share space, not just with each other, but with the wider, more than human world, and celebrate the diversity of this planet and learn to be enchanted once again. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Willow, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
A very small question to start us off. This is something I think about quite a lot, and because the reality is we're living in a world of what appears to be polycrises, right? Or a polycrisis. It's so many different issues that I think people feel very overwhelmed. They don't know where to start or where to dig in or where to focus. But I think in some ways it's pretty illusory. I think a lot of them come down to very common themes or roots. And for me, in the context of this conversation and climate in particular, the phrase that has been growing in my mind quite a lot the last few years has been I think we're in crisis because of ecological dissociation. That's really how I've come to understand it. I think that we have been living as a species in such a state of disconnect from the rest of life on Earth. And that's not a happy accident. I think that there have been very real forces that have driven that divide. I mean, you could trace it back to colonization, to industrial revolution, etc. But we've fallen out of a sense of enchantment or a sense of connectedness with the other beings that we share this planet with, and it's almost like we've been ripped out of the context that we grew in as a species. And I think confronting that is incredibly terrifying. I think that, if you've ever experienced, any personal level of dissociation because of, say, a trauma, right? A trauma creates separation. That's what dissociation is. The first step, confronting the time lost, confronting the weight of it, it's overwhelming. But you're never going to heal and you're never going to move forward until that happens. And that's, I think, the moment that we are in is so critically. We have to hold space for people to not look away, to surrender to that understanding, because then the healing starts. And what's on the other side of that, the antithesis to dissociation, is embodiment, right? And what I think we want here is maybe I won't speak for everyone, but I would love to see our species be more ecologically embodied, which is to say more deeply rooted in this world that we live in again. And there is so much wonder that exists on the other side of that. I mean, I've been really learning quite a lot about biomimicry lately, which is, essentially turning to the natural world for design inspiration, how we design our lives, how we design society. And Janine Benyus, who's the founder of the Biomimicry Institute, she puts it so incredibly. She says, we are surrounded by teachers, like millions of other organisms who have figured out how to live in right relationship with this planet in a way that's elegant and regenerative and long lasting. And so part of the overcoming of the dissociation is saying, hey, we're in this context and we are connected to all of these other organisms on this planet that we can learn good design from, that we can learn sustainability from. So it seems terrifying. And I think that's why so many people want to turn away from the idea of crisis. But I think anyone who's been on any kind of healing journey knows that it's so worth it to look into the wound, because that's where the medicine is. And I think if we only talk about the climate crisis as if it's the symptom, or as if it's the disease and not the symptom, we're missing the deeper disconnect. It was a very long-winded.
That's not long-winded at all. I hope you turn that into an essay and publish it. That was beautiful.
It's threaded throughout. We published a book of my work through Atmos last year called The Overview. And it's a collection of essays I've written over the years, and that's kind of the through line, I would say.
Brilliant. I feel torn. There's a part of me that would really love to keep going down that path with you. And there's another part of me that wants to flip it on its head and examine any assumptions that there might be there, any romanticizing as well, which I think is such an important part of being a human, is romanticizing what it is to be alive. And if we all did a little bit more romanticizing, we'd probably all be a little bit happier, especially living together. But how do I put this? At the moment,
flip it on its head. Do it.
Yeah. Is that what you want to do? Okay, let's do it. Let's do it.
No one does that with me, and I welcome it. Do it.
Yeah. All right. I've been thinking about writing this for a couple of weeks. I just haven't found the time, so this is good. This gives me a chance to kind of work it out. that thing that you said at the end, and we'll come back to all of what you said about trauma and dissociation embodiment. That's beautiful. I'm going to take that and cite you in future. I loved that. It's such a profound kind of mirror. And it's so obvious as well, isn't it, that there's something about getting back into our bodies, getting away from screens, getting away from artificiality, and using our bodies to get back into the wider body of the earth. I completely agree with all of you, with you all on that. I think what I want to challenge, and when I hear it, I always want to challenge it essentially, is this idea that like the natural world has a design or has a plan, or is existing in this kind of like perfect, complex stasis, if you will, that allows everything to self-actualize almost, right? And it was what you said about biomimicry and this woman saying, the founder of this text, saying that, you know, they've all figured out how to exist in this sort of like harmony. I disagree. I don't think that it is that. And I'll tell you why, if I may.
Please.
For the first time in my whole career recently, I have spent some time with Indigenous communities around Latin America. And I've been really surprised at what I've seen, surprised in, you know, really beautiful senses, and surprised in also like, this isn't really how we talk about it in the global north. Communities are using the energy that is available to them. And when they get more energy, they use that too. So deep in the Amazon, you know, with communities that only sort of came into contact with the rest of the world 60 years ago, they're using fossil fuels. They're using fossil fuels, but despite their identity still being mostly, you know, we are part of this land and we want to protect this land. They're now using solar panels as well, which is great, obviously. But there's this idea of like, I don't think human beings or living beings as a general rule tend to sort of like actively design or limit their interactions with the environment. I think it's the environment that limits us in a sense. And that's where the stasis is found, in this like complex system of relationship. So if I try and, this is the first time I kind of said it out loud, so bear with me, but if I think of the example of like, let's use the example of a lion pride, right? Mm-hmm. If somebody was just feeding them dead zebra carcasses all the time, they wouldn't move. They wouldn't go anywhere. They would just eat and eat and eat and eat. They would probably eat until they were full. But their entire relationship with their environment and their wider role in the environment would suddenly kind of be disjointed and affected, because they're getting the thing that they need, which is what all biological creatures seek, which is an energy surplus. And this sort of like biological impulse to seek energy, I think in human beings, we've tend to put like a moral argument on top of it and said that, oh, it's greed, rather than it's actually just kind of normal. And the only reason that all creatures aren't doing it is because they are limited in ways by the external system, by the environment. So it's not that anything has figured out how to do something perfectly or harmoniously. It's that the big picture is balancing itself out. And I think for me, that does a couple of things. Like, it's another step of kind of taking human beings off of the pedestal of like being another separate amazing creature, either amazing in like, oh, our intellect, or amazing in like, oh, look at all this sin we're capable of doing. You know, this like human exceptionalism, even in the negative. And also then takes away the moral judgment of behaviors that are not great, but also kind of normal. And then also, I think, does the really difficult work of like maybe saying, maybe there isn't one wide answer. Maybe there isn't one way of doing things. Maybe the natural world isn't like mummy or daddy who we can also turn to. Like, we are going to have to take accountability and responsibility and learn, of course, learn what there is to learn, but not give over. You know, the right-wing impulse to like give over to a strong man. I wonder sometimes if there's like a left-wing impulse to kind of like return to the womb in a sense. Do you know what I mean? I'll stop there because I'm starting to lose the thread. But Go.
Well, no, I love what you just shared. There's so much to chew on there. I think, and I don't disagree with anything that you shared. I think the thing I really want to highlight that I was sharing from Janine was, something her name is Janine Benyus. She wrote the book on biomimicry in 1997, and she co-founded the Biomimicry Institute. She's um, quite a remarkable woman, but they've pioneered, bullet trains inspired by kingfishers, and
Oh, cool.
air circulation inspired by termite vents. Like, these are the kinds of projects that biomimicry is focused on. So when I talk about learning from specific species who have figured out how to um, exist on this planet in a way, in right relationship to it, those are the kinds of specific examples that I'm talking about. But what Janine says that has really stuck with me is that life creates the conditions conducive to life. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not, to me, that is in harmony with what you're sharing about the environment itself creating checks and
Yeah.
balances, right? And to some degree, that is what, the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis are, is like it's the environment saying there is going to be checks and balances here to your
Yeah.
behavior. So it's simultaneously holding that we are part of life, and therefore we're being limited by our environment, and also in the same way life checks other species, we have to allow ourselves to be checked by life and humble
Totally.
ourselves and say, okay, so what are, and I love what you're saying about not shaming us for, someone really recently raised this perspective with me that, for so long, the fossil fuel industry was powering people's homes, right, and bringing them energy. It's like at a certain point in time, that could have been seen as altruistic, or it could have been
Mm.
seen as it was a service to society, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think we have to be careful when and where we're placing shame, right? We can't have
Mm-hmm.
shame as a species just because we have wanted to thrive,
Yeah.
or we've wanted to extend life expectancy. We've wanted to
Yeah.
live on this planet in a way that minimizes disease, that, all of these
Yeah.
things. But we also have to be willing to humble ourselves to say and recognize when it's gone too far.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm happy that you brought up the word morality, because it's something I've been really like wrestling with lately, which is um have you read Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's latest book, What If We Get It Right? It's a
No, I
great,
haven't.
she's a marine biologist and climate policy expert, and it's a whole book of conversations around climate solutions. And um anyway, there's a chapter in it called "There's Nothing Naive About Moral Clarity,"
Mm.
and she's kind of arguing for the
Nice.
fact that we do need to have some moral clarity. Like, we do need to be able to say it's wrong to destroy our environment. It's wrong to poison specific communities by giving them an unhealthy environment. So it's, morality, it's such an interesting thing, because nature doesn't, as you're sort of pointing towards, nature doesn't have morality. Like, nature is, everything is trying to get what it needs in order to survive and thrive. But
Mm-hmm.
we've created these moral codes to create society by, so that we're not all murdering each other. And so, and part of the problem is that I think we've really reached a breakdown of failing to agree upon those collective morals that become our laws, right? We're
Yeah.
seeing a president who's ignoring the Constitution, we're at constitutional rights, and um, checks and balances from Supreme Court, etc. So
Mm-hmm.
it's, but then at the same time, we also see morality weaponized and turned into shame in a very harmful way that also has allowed some, people like him to rise to power through religion, etc. So I've been struggling a lot with morality. It's an interesting one. It's like, how do we collectively come to, how can we come together and say, like, there's nothing, we can release the shame that we feel about as a species, because I think that Brene Brown, the emotions researcher, she's pointed out that if someone is in shame, it's actually incredibly difficult for them psychologically to change or grow.
Yeah.
So we have this whole world where everyone's just trying to shame each other.
Yeah.
and trying to expect that that is going to create some kind of different outcome or change. And we have to figure out how to move past that, including as a species. Like, we have to let go of the shame that I think we feel for being human and just instead make it more, you know, this isn't working. We have fallen out of alignment, or we're butting up against our environment in the kind of way you're framing it, of like our environment is telling us that we need to check ourselves. Can we humble ourselves and listen without the shame?
I completely agree with you. And I wonder about that, this question of morality. Let's keep going on that for a bit, because obviously you're right. Like, human society is human culture, maybe not society, but human culture certainly perpetuates itself through certain moral stories. Although arguably I would say society perpetuates itself through the energy that is available to us. And then, like, the relationship between society and culture is kind of mandated by the relationship between morals and energy. And it's so obviously not the correct, and I use this phrasing deliberately, it's so obviously not the correct thing to do for a biological organism to destroy its environment. That's stupid. But is it a question of morality in this sense of like good and evil? Is that an evil thing to do? Is it just self-destructive? Is it because we have so much energy surplus available that essentially really we live in a world where there are a handful of people who are making decisions that then destroy the environments of other people? And that's what feels morally abhorrent, and frankly I think is morally abhorrent. How then do you square that with the need to provide the services that you were saying, like the need for an energy surplus in society and the desire to move to renewable energy, and the impact that that's going to have on communities around the world, both indigenous communities and the more than human world? Like, how do we create a moral framework for that doesn't divide the world into binaries, but rather tries to do this more Eastern kind of, can we see the big picture, and not in a utilitarian sense, what makes the most sense for the most people, but that ascribes to a code of wellness, of prioritizing relationship, of being in the world, of embodiment. And I think that as long as we continued with the morality binary of good and evil, we won't get there, right? Because the very nature of such a framework would suggest that we need to have all stakeholders involved. And if you don't agree, if you can't even begin to have a conversation with somebody who holds a different perspective to you, then we're not going to be able to get all stakeholders involved. And obviously a hugely pertinent example, and has been a pertinent example for decades on our planet, is Israel and Palestine. And how can these two, groups come together to have discussions? The fact that there have been times when that has happened and it's been deliberately undermined, the way that it gets discussed as a moral question to kind of then justify mass murder. I mean, it's a terrible example that has taken over 50,000 Palestinian lives, but it shows just how easy it is to fall into the morality binary of good and evil, and how important it is that we move past it. And I think what you're saying about shame is, God, I loved Brené Brown in my early 20s. I haven't really thought about her in a long time, but she was great. She did I'm sure she still does such good work, but I remember when she was huge, and she was doing something that felt special, I think, in a time when therapy was really kind of peak. The Western world was peak therapy, and that was giving people the tools themselves, right? And we discussed this a little bit before hitting record, but maybe if you'd like to take this and then tie it into, like, how do we have these conversations? How do we create conversations that release people from shame? How do we have conversations with people that we vehemently disagree with? How do we find the limit of, where is the limit of when you should try to have a conversation? Do we stick with what Baldwin said, which I think was probably right? Like, you try up until a person wants to see you dead. Like, you cannot have a conversation with that person. And how do we expect to solve, quote unquote, the polycrisis if we can't even solve, our political institutions at like a regional or a state or or a national level.
Well, I think, just to respond to a few different threads there, I think it is all kind of the same thing. It's all kind of the same question, right? Which is separation. That's what we're talking about here. Like, going back to my answer to the original question about what this crisis is, our separation with the natural world, but also like how we are the divides we've created between us and other people who we feel do not share our values or beliefs. And I think there's a big piece in what you were sharing in the conversation about morality that I think comes down to, one of the largest sort of lessons we can take from nature's playbook, which is adaptation. We are working within some really, truly crumbling institutions and frameworks in how we think about the world. And, our laws are essentially our morals, but codified. And something I'm very excited about is like the rights of nature movement,
Yeah.
which is, giving legal rights to the more than human world. And some of the ways they're going about doing it are just really are so incredible. I don't know if you're familiar with the SETI project and Moth, the More Than Human Life initiative, but essentially they're working with program SETI, which is decoding whale communication through AI, and which I have a lot of feelings about AI, but we can do a different podcast episode about that. But one thing that they're uncovering is how intricate whale communication is. That they've already uncovered that whales have an alphabet that they work with. And not only that, not only that, this part really blew my mind. Whales have dialects. Like, depending on where in the world they're talking. And dialect is a direct function of culture and place, right? And they're actually taking this language piece, and then they're working with NYU's, law program, essentially, to then challenge certain laws that we have. Because, for example, if you can prove that a whale has language and culture and dialects, that makes it easier to, in some ways, fight for their legal protections and their rights. So, for example, there are certain laws against I'm careful of saying too much that I haven't researched myself, but there are certain laws about how sound and noise can be used as torture for humans, right? And so some of the ways in which we have disturbed underwater echolocation and communication, well, suddenly, can you argue that that might be torture if you're seeing these beings under there as sentient creatures who communicate in complex ways, who rely on their hearing? And so that is like a whole world where I'm just like, we have to rethink about or expand our framework for morality that underlies all of our laws, right? And that's like something that's happening right now. So I'm gonna kind of leave that piece there for a second.
Thank you so much.
The second part about how, I mean, I'm a big believer in breaking down binaries. I think, I've raised Israel and Palestine as an issue very close to my heart. My ancestry is part Palestinian, and I really truly believe it is one of the biggest issues of the world right now because it represents everything. It is the wound of the world. It is, how do we share space? How do we reconcile with history? How do we put violence down? Who gets to decide a narrative, right?
Yeah.
It's everything in one thing. And there's the people who are firmly gripping to one side and doubling down on, what the story has been for so long. And there's other people who are waking up. And there's a reason that, aside from the genocide not ending, there's a reason it's not going away, because this is like what our species is trying to figure out right now. I think in a lot of ways, and is how we move forward. And I think how do we have conversations with people who might not share our views? I think seeing the other, first of all, out of the bat, I would say is not making assumptions. I've been in a number of situations where I could have very easily assumed that the other person might not respect me or might think something about me or whatnot. And I have found that me actually just being kind and being myself and saying hello, like, even if it's honestly like walking down the street and someone's staring at me, like, what are you? And I'm just like, I'll just be like, hi, how are you? And start a conversation. And like, I actually watch the impact that that has,
Yeah.
you know? And that has informed a lot of how like I move about the world as a trans woman and like today essentially of just like I don't think I think where I've arrived is like I don't think it's particularly effective for me to like shout at strangers and say like you have to accept me for who I am. It doesn't work and it's not effective. But I have found that just showing up as myself and um, it kind of comes back to embodiment and just like embodying who I am and what I have to offer the world when I'm afforded the care that I need and things like that. That has a much bigger impact. Like I watch what happens when like I sit down, maybe it's at an event or a dinner or something, and I'm talking to someone, maybe they're a little uncomfortable, maybe whatever, and I watch like the ease almost where it's like I can feel what's happening in their body, which is like, oh, she's just a person. So, and I think that there were times earlier in my journey where I would have not even put myself in a situation where I would be sitting across from someone who I didn't trust. I think that there's something there to really showing up authentically and not making assumptions about. I had someone put it this way to me once, like, never assumes where someone is in their story. Or even that someone can't change their story. And I think we do so much assuming for other people. And um, so I think setting aside assumptions is a really big piece. And um, I think another piece is just so many people just want to be heard. Like they want to be understood. They want to know, like they want to not feel dismissed. And um, I think being able to show up with empathy, like you can stand, there is a way to stand up for what you believe and what you feel is true for you and also be compassionate. And I think that's what we are missing, especially in the United States right now, is like I am more that it was never a given to me that like every person in the country I live in was going to accept me or whatever else. But the premise of this country was meant to be that we can share space with people who don't share our beliefs and not outright attack each other. And I think that's what's been, engendered by this particular administration. And so I think the answer can't be to like further attack the right. Like it's kind of we have to try to wake people up from this spell because it's like the classic, you know, authoritarian playbook to just turn people against each other so that you can keep seizing the power. And the way to overcome that is to try to build bridges and extend our hands.
I love what you just said, and I love that you tied it into embodiment as well, because I've been thinking recently about the difference between political movements and crowds, say, like the people within those that make up the movements, and also political identities and bodies. And I've been thinking about how I think on the left internationally, and I say that very broadly in the sense of like, you know, the left is actually, you know, a politics of liberation, and there's still really brilliant activists and campaigners and academics who are doing that work. But the left that kind of got mainstreamed, if you will, was identity politics, And I think possibly, I would say like a politics of narcissism. Like, how does all of this theory apply to me and only me?
Mm-hmm.
And how, like, it's my right then to make the world kind of shift on its axis to me
Mm-hmm.
rather than go out and ask and be in relationship with the rest of the world as well. Um, and because you shared, let me share something that happened to me recently, which was the very first time I'd been on the opposite side of that equation, like body versus political identity, because I come from the United Kingdom, I've lived around Europe. I generally tend to, in the places that I've been, I've tended to belong to the majority race group, and have tended to mostly stay in circles that predominantly belonged to white people. Um, and so the spaces that I was in, it was mostly the binary of like man versus women, and in that heated political discussions, I was very used to playing the I'm a woman card, so I trump essentially. Like, whatever you have to say about this experience because of your gender identity, it's less valid. And obviously there would be cases for that. I wouldn't sort of say that about, like, if we were talking about the male experience, for example, but often talking about the male experience would then become, yeah, but what about the women's experience? What about So, so I tried to kind of get out of it a little bit, but tended to find that in like particularly heated conversations I would default to that, right? And then it wasn't until it happened to me that I realized just how devastating that can be, in which I was in an environment where I was the only white person, and was working with really marginalized Afro-Colombians and trying to build bridges and trying to build trust and recognizing that was going to take time. And I was happy to do that. And there was one person who just didn't really want to give it. Like, no matter what I tried, no matter what I did, and who I found was kind of like implicitly, I don't think deliberately, but like implicitly also undermining the bridges that were being built. She was very protective of her community. Um, and essentially we sort of had it out one day. And I was trying really hard. I was like, what has happened? What's going on? You invited me here. You invited me here, and I'm working with you, and I've done everything to put the power that I have at your feet. And I, explained the reasons the way that I tried to do that, and was also like, I recognize that there's a power imbalance. I'm not saying that there's not, but what else did you want me to do, and how could I have done it? And could you have told me that, if you needed more from me? Like, what happened? And she talked about colonization and about the white man and about slavery. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, I am the white man to her. And she comes from a country where she has been massively mistreated by the white man in a way probably that doesn't really happen exactly in the same way in the part of the world that I come from. But also, so I got it, and then I was like, how do I navigate this? Because I get it, and I have empathy for that, but I'm also not going to take that identity. I am not that political identity. I'm a person who showed up and trying to do this work. And it was a really difficult conversation. It was going through a translator as well to add like another level of nuance. But eventually we managed to come to a place of like bending with each other a little bit. And which was really important to me. And I was really grateful to her for that. But what it really made me think of afterwards was like, oh, I can't play that card anymore. I can't thrust an entire political identity on a body because I have no idea about that body's experience. I have no idea what they actually think. I can't make assumptions for them. And also, how am I ever going to build bridges with anybody if all I see them as is the thing that abused me or oppressed me or assaulted me or whatever it is? Like, it's just never going to work. And I've been thinking about that in the context of the left and how we move forward, and how is it that we can see that, white men in flyover states who have traditionally benefited from patriarchy and misogyny and racism and all of this kind of stuff, and who have benefited more than any other political identity, might also be struggling in their bodies and might
Yeah.
need space as well.
I mean, thank you for sharing the story. I mean, I think it's so poignant because what it illustrates is the fact that part of like the impact that trauma has on people in the world is that it is the it is I want to be careful how to say this. When I'm in a state that is triggered or I'm experiencing a stranger a certain way, it is most often not about that person. It is the
Mm.
past acting on me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is the role of lingering trauma. It
Mm.
is the past acting on us. And I was hesitant because I don't want to say that there are not still actively systems of oppression in place
Sure.
that are traumatizing people right now.
Sure.
But that's what trauma is, right? It's the past acting on us. And that is where we have to be so careful because I think that there's I mean, speaking of gender, it's just like in the US, it is so easy to just like hate on men, right? Like,
Mm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm guilty of it. Like, people do it all the time. And also, it's no wonder that like young men have been radicalized
Totally.
now to the other
Totally.
side because who wants
Of
to
course.
feel hated just
Yeah.
because they're men? And so we have to follow bell hooks,
Mm-hmm.
instruction. We have to. I have a friend who's always like every time she goes to complain about men, she always says, "I made a promise to bell hooks," and she always like looks up at the sky. And um, those things matter. It does
Mm-hmm.
matter. We have to hold the damage that the patriarchy has done.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be willing to hold that and also not take it out on every single man because
Yeah.
we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize people's individual hurt. It's like I think about the UK and like J.K. Rowling. It's like I recognize that like she's been hurt by men.
Yeah.
And that's where this
Right.
comes from, right? And to the
Yeah.
point where it's like she's seeing that in that's her lens. And I don't invalidate that for her. Like I'm sorry for whatever it is that she went through.
Yeah.
And I can hold that it's not about me, and I think that's where we have to like really do that internal work of like being able to know and have those moments like the moment you had where you recognize like, oh, there's something being imprinted on me
Mm-hmm.
that this person is working through. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do we, rather than villainize that person, or how do we hold space for that so that they can heal? Because if people don't heal, none of this is going
Mm.
to change.
Yeah.
And this is like I mean, you and I, we are like getting it. This is this is the shit that I think is under everything.
Yeah.
And I think so much of it comes down to empathy and like being willing to, it's just, it's
But
so
it's
easy.
hard.
It's hard.
But
It's
empathy
hard.
is hard. This
It's
is
hard.
the other thing. I was interviewed by two lovely Gen Z women for their podcast. They're at university and they interviewed me yesterday. And I'd been like in a deep writing day. And when you're in a deep writing day and your brain is just like boom, boom, boom. So they were asking me like really normal questions. And I was like, let's go, straight to Mars, straight away. And they brought up the empathy thing. And I was like, it's hard. And I feel like we live in a culture where it's kind of spoken about as if like, oh, you just do that thing. Or Instagram tells you to be empathetic. And then if you
Right.
can't do it, it's some kind of like moral failure. And it's like, but it's hard work, empathy. First of all, we're not taught to do it in our like hyper neoliberal libertarian society that wants to keep us separate economically, culturally, bodily. So we're not taught how to do it. And if you look at young children, I'm sorry, but nobody's going to convince me that we are born with empathy as some kind of like innate trait, because little toddlers are tyrants. They want what they want when they want. And if you take away what they want, they will scream at you. It's something that's obviously inculcated in culture. I think something that also we have to admit probably happens easier when you are dealing with people who look like you and sound like you because of the millions of years of evolution and of tribal kind of social organization. Um, and then also it's really hard to do with people that you agree with, for one, because people can often be annoying, let alone people that you don't agree with, because they're beyond annoying. They feel dangerous. They feel like an existential threat. And very often they are an existential threat. So how do we cultivate empathy in this world where we're not getting taught how to do it? And also, if you exist in certain leftist circles where when you get it wrong, it can go badly for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I mean,
This is such a good conversation, by the way. I'm so enjoying it.
good, me too. I think one, I think it's letting go of the idea of getting it perfect. Like, I really love, like, I'm calling Adrienne Marie Brown in this moment. She's someone who, this has come up in so many of her and my conversations over the years. It's just, and she put it once, that she was just like, I've really released the idea of like me being perfect. She's like, and that has just like opened up my whole life, because now every time I make a mistake, I'm like, oh yeah, I have an opportunity to grow here.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, actually we're meant to make mistakes and we're meant to get it wrong, but we're living in this culture that like, it's not even just shaming. It's like as soon as you learn something, like you show up with other people and you're like, well, I've always known this, and how dare you not know this? As if as if I didn't learn this like 10 minutes ago. And it's obnoxious. And I actually think what you were sharing earlier around like identity politics, yes, and I think even more than that, it's the virtue signaling that like really got us here in a lot of ways. It's like I think about how like this is good, like this is gonna sound, might go down like a whole wormhole, but it's like I don't know any trans person who was like screaming at everyone that they needed to share their pronouns all the time, right? But that like became the left's thing, was like, you need to have your pronouns everywhere, and like corporations took it on and it became this whole thing. And it's like, but like look at the swing that caused, and now look who's paying for it. And it's like that and it's hard because it's like I don't want to disparage like any of the good-natured people who are like, here are my pronouns, because that it comes from such a good place, right? But I think like why I'm bringing that into this conversation is like you brought up social media, and it's just like it's so hard because things are going so quickly and they spread so fast. It was like 6 years ago no one was talking about pronouns, and then it became everywhere, and then all of a sudden it radicalized the right, and then it's just so it's I don't have the answer to that. I don't know how we got from empathy to pronouns.
But just on that, it's like the way there's something about let's call it like toxic allyship, which like does come from a good place, but then kind of suggests to the entire world, like if you're not focusing on this, like this thing is now the most important thing, and etc. And like quite frankly, I don't now correct me if I am wrong, but I don't think that pronouns were like at the top of trans people's agendas. It was access to medical care and access to legal protection,
and the irony is we had all of that stuff better before. Like we have always been here, and now we're actually losing stuff because like honestly all I want is to just like disappear into public life and like not be the center of like an election. And it's like now we are, because of how much, and it's like we are 1% of the population. It's like the fact, and I also, like, to be clear, cannot put all of this on the left and good-natured people who are virtue singing, because obviously there's like very deliberate scapegoating that has happened. But it's an example of like, I think like to tie some of these things together that I want to bring in. It comes back to the shame culture, right? Because it is a feeling of shame that makes someone go, like, need to prove, like, I'm good enough. I can be accepted here because I just shared my pronouns. It's like, and if we can just, like, all be a little bit easier with each other, I think, like, that, like, I know so many people who are just so terrified of like getting it wrong all the time. And like actually some of my best friends are like my friends who like are totally unafraid to like get it wrong. And I'm just like, and like one of my best girlfriends, like she'll say something sometimes and then she'll be like, that felt weird when I said it. I shouldn't say that, should I? And I'm like, yeah, it's not great. Like, and that's the kind of relationship we have. And I'll be like, like I won't speak for everyone, but for me, I like, I don't love how that feels. And it's like, it can be that easy if we can like I guess, like, create a little bit more of an environment of trusting each other, and that it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to, like, get things wrong. And so I'm bringing that back to say that, like, the empathy is hard, and we need to be okay with ourselves in the times where, because, like, we will all get triggered. We will all
Yeah.
come from a place sometimes where we are tired, or where, like, I see J.K. Rowling post a photo with a cigar, and it's like, it's hard for me to empathize in that moment, you know? And it's
Yeah.
like those moments will happen,
Yeah.
and we can be okay with ourselves, and we can get back up, and we can try again the next day,
Yeah.
the next moment, the next interaction. And um yeah, it's where I'm at anyway.
I think that's beautiful, and I think it's a really necessary place to arrive at. It took me ages as well, and I'm still frightened of having certain conversations, you know. And there's like conversations that I have in private that are like really interesting, intellectually stimulating, and emotionally challenging conversations that I would be frightened to have on the show because of the nature of like, how do I put this? Like the nature of trying to homogenize the lived experience to fit, you know, the political identity, because quite frankly, it's easier to understand the world if you see it in a set of political identities than if you see every person, and not necessarily as like this kind of lionized individual, because the cult of the individual is also a problem, but just like a body. That this is for me is really, really helping. Like just trying to see everybody as like a body kind of bumbling through, you know, in relationship with their environment, in relationship with other people, in relationship with, you know, these inanimate objects that totally dominate our lives as well, like our phones and our computers. And also, you know, carrying around this mind that wants to go off in a million different directions and is actually quite like impressionable and a bit feeble in comparison to this amazing kind of like skeleton and muscle and all the stuff that we have. Um, it's much more difficult to engage with the world if you were trying to see everybody as a moment in time rather than as a culmination of history that you can accurately define.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, putting people in boxes is how you, and that is also so much at the heart of all this, right? And I think
Mm.
about, like, the horseshoe of politics and all of it, of,
Mm.
like, identity politics on the left going all the way around to, like, trying to put people in traditional roles according to,
Yeah.
like, whatever on the right. It's like, it's not that different. And I think,
Yeah.
like, there is a very big growing of movement of people up here that are more like, you know, can we all just be people?
Yeah.
And I think that does not, it needs to include looking at the ways that, like, the very real ways of that gender and race and all of these, you know, aspects of who we are, play into equity and the world that
Yep.
we live in.
Yeah.
We can do that work together without the shaming of making people
Yep.
wrong. Um and I think politics are a part of that, because, yeah, it's so easy to be like, you're conservative, you probably think this about me or whatnot. And
Yeah.
because it makes the experience of moving through the world easier, as you say, but it also reduces the wondrous biodiversity of it. And
Yeah. Right.
that's, like, what we're talking about here, right? Is it's just like, do we want to live in a world where we're the only species, where
Mm.
everything is homogenized, or do we want to live in a world of sprawling diversity?
Mm.
And
I mean, that's the world I would like to live in. Absolutely. And I think that it's going to take so much. I don't like this verb, I have to say. I want to find another verb. But for now, unlearning. Because even within the academy, you know, like the dematerialization essentially of theory, this like hyper intellectualization of the lived body, even the really confusing language that is used to describe what is quite frankly everyday experiences for most people, i.e., oppression and abuse and pain and trauma and all of this kind of stuff. You know, the way that it gets
sort of written about is incredibly sort of gate-kept, I would say. That we're really going to have to take a hard look at all of the things that brought us to where we are. And it's not just, colonization. It's not just the white man. It's not just the gender question or racism. It's how we have also perpetuated those systems of division between us, and helped facilitate, it helped create the conditions where we are today. And I think that is a really important thing to consider, because it gives you a sense of agency in that moment, I think, to move away from just the kind of the childlike perspective of like, things have only happened to me, not just that I have also acted in the world. And just to clarify, that doesn't mean I don't think anybody ever deserves the abuse or the oppression or the trauma that they receive, but just feeling again into that body and realizing I've got a little bit of agency in my tiny part of the world here, and that's all I need to impact. And if I can build networks with people and start to impact there, then maybe they'll network out and start impacting there, and then we can actually start to build a different kind of world, like a multi-plural world, a many world within the world. Because I think to envision a top-down politics that actually fixes all of the problems that we've been discussing here, I think is probably part of the problem, because the amount that you have to simplify at each strata, at each level of the problem, that's then a function of violence, really. You're simplifying so much to make sense in order to fix things in their place. I don't want to live in that world anymore. I'm done. I'd like to exit. Willow, this has been absolutely extraordinary. Thank you so much for joining me. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I mentioned her earlier, but Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson has been a big inspiration for me lately. Her book, What If We Get It Right? It's a roadmap of possibilities and climate solutions. And I think a lot of people don't understand that we have so many of the solutions that we need. It's not a great big mystery in terms of climate solutions. And this book it presents a number of them in a very engaging and accessible way.
Wonderful. Willow, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great, and I really look forward as well to the launch of your podcast, which I encourage everybody to go and listen to as well. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.